everyone, Rose here, and I made my boy Pearl. I really wanted to sculpt a dragon for today's video, but I wasn't quite sure what kind, so I let Discord vote between a couple of different sketches and Pearl. Pearl won, but I also really liked the first sketch I'd made, so I decided to mix in a couple of features from that into his design. And here's what I came up with. Nothing particularly complicated, just some slightly different horns. I've actually made a bust of Pearl before, so this is also kind of like remaking an old artwork and seeing how I've improved and how my designs and stuff have changed. Anyway, that's been enough of an intro, on to the time-lapse. Like with most of my models, I do the blocking in Blender because I'm a bit more comfortable with the transform and edit mode tools here. For this model, I start with a sphere and then use sculpt mode to shape it into a dragon head. I use the grab brushes to pull and push stuff around to form the basic shape, and then use clay strips and draw sharp to bring out the more important structures like the brow bone, cheekbone, and mouth. Next, I add in a plane which I merge down into a single vertex, and add a skin modifier and a subdivision surface modifier as well as a mirror modifier, and use that whole setup to make the horns and the neck. When making dragons, I have a tendency personally to focus heavily on the side profile and sort of neglect other angles. You'll notice, for example, that all the sketches I made were just from the profile and didn't feature any 3/4 views or front views or anything like that. Now that works for sketches, but obviously 3D models are 3D, so they kind of have to work from more than just one angle. That's something I didn't pay nearly enough attention to for some of my oldest dragon sculpts, including that first sculpt of Pearl. So for this one, I took extra care to look at the model from all kinds of different angles and made sure it worked. One of the most important places to pay attention to different angles was the eyes. I want Pearl, as well as most of my dragons, to have front-facing eyes, kind of like birds of prey or big cats. That means I obviously have to look at the model from the front to make sure both eyes are visible and looking forward. But at the same time, I want the eyes to look appealing from a 3/4 view and from the side view because that's where I think the model will be viewed from the most. With all the pieces in place, I make some minor tweaks here and there, add the scales to the neck, and then add in an extra object for the body. I ended up deleting that later though because I found a more appealing way to just have the model end at the neck. At some point I want to make a full body model of a dragon, but I've been really busy with commissions recently, so I haven't really had the time to dedicate to something that would take so long. And now it's time for the main event, or at least the thing that makes Pearl's design relatively unique as a dragon. Crystals. I add in a crystal, set it to have 6 sides, and add a pointed tip. Then I duplicate it over and use ctrl+b+v to bevel certain corners and give them all slightly unique shapes. I'm not basing these on any one specific types of crystal, I just looked up crystals and picked references that I thought looked cool, though they did end up having a slightly similar vibe to quartz since they're 6-sided with pointy tips. I did try and make sure that all the crystals I made had the same general vibe, so they looked like they are in fact the same mineral. But at the same time, I also wanted them to look different enough that it wouldn't be super obvious that there's just a whole bunch of copy-pasted crystals on the back of the dragon. Once I had a couple of crystals I was happy with, I moved them to the front of the dragon and then started copying them and arranging them along his head and neck. I start with the biggest crystals around the center line and on the jaw, and then work my way smaller and smaller as I go towards the edges. To keep the whole thing looking a bit more naturalistic, I make sure the crystals along the center line and in very conspicuous places like the front of the head aren't fully symmetrical. For the crystals slightly further away from the center line, I add in a mirror modifier with the mirror object set to the head, so I don't have to manually place the crystals on both sides. That being said, in this case, the mirror modifier is temporary because the shader I'm going to be using later on relies on the crystal's local rotation, and using a mirror modifier doesn't give you a new rotation for the mirrored version of the object. It's actually quite difficult to mirror an object if you need the mirrored version to have a specific rotation, because even if you use Ctrl+M or scale on the x-axis that only affects the scale, so the rotation is still gonna be off. I'll explain later when I actually do it how I end up flipping the crystals over to the other side. But for now, back to actually placing the crystals. As you can see, I placed every single one manually. I didn't use any tool to like automatically place them. I don't like using particle systems for this kind of thing, for large objects like this, because I want them placed relatively specifically and rotated kind of specifically. And I didn't use geometry nodes because I have never touched geometry nodes, and I did want to try and learn a new tool just for this one thing. I'm gonna look into it at some point, but not today. But yeah, as with the rest of the process, while arranging the crystals, I made sure to take a look at the model from all kinds of different angles to make sure the shape and such that it created was nice. I ended up having, I think, one crystal sticking out that made it a little bit awkward, like the silhouette a little bit awkward from one angle, but I noticed that way too late, so that's just how it's gonna be. Can't be too perfect, I guess. It's supposed to look like they naturally grew there. Alongside the crystals on the back of the neck and head, I also added some around the base of the neck by the shoulders. I figured these would make a very nice stopping point, like very natural edge for this bust. So I deleted the body, and in sculpt mode I used mask slice and fill holes to cut off the excess parts of the neck under the mane. And then I got back to placing crystals. The idea for pearl, or rather jewel dragons in general, is that they have these tiny little hairs or like feathers in between their scales, and they live in these volcanic regions that have hot springs full of these dissolved minerals, and these minerals get stuck in the little feathers or hairs on their bodies and slowly grow into these large crystals the longer they spend in and around the pools. Depending on the exact location, different pools have different mineral compositions, so the crystals grown from them are gonna have different shapes and especially different colors. So just from looking at the mane of a jewel dragon, you'll be able to tell where it's lived and where it spent like most of its time. And speaking of color, it's time to work on the shader a bit. Usually I wait with the materials till I'm completely done with a model, but I kind of couldn't wait because I wanted to make them shiny. The core of this shader is a mix between a translucent BSDF and a glossy BSDF. And I'm using the Fresnel output from a layer weight node in order to control how they're mixed. Mixing your shaders together like this gives you relatively accurate glossiness, but also importantly allows you to control the color of said glossiness, which is something you can't do with a principled shader. And speaking of fun colors, I used the random output from an object info node to slightly randomize the color of the translucent shader. Now this might be slightly hard to notice in the time-lapse, but the right side of the model is weirdly dark. And that's because I'm using a gradient texture for the base color of the crystals, and that doesn't flip over with a mirror modifier. So I'm gonna have to find another way to mirror my crystals while also keeping their rotation so that the gradient still works. My solution for that is to delete all the mirror modifiers, then take all the crystals that are on the side, so not the ones on the center line, parent them to a new empty in the middle of the scene, duplicate all the objects along with the empty, and then take that new empty and scale it to -1 on the x-axis. That way they're all flipped over and have the local rotation the way I want it to be. If you just scale the object without the parent, they don't get a new rotation, so they'll be flipped over to the other side in terms of scale and position, but they're still gonna have the old rotation, so that doesn't really work. Now my colors are properly mapping onto all the crystals, and I mess around with the glossiness a little bit more. At this point, I'm still doing my shading in Eevee, but for the final model I'm going to be switching over to cycles because that way I can mess around with more like transparency and refraction, because Eevee's just not that good at it. But before I tell you more about the shaders, it's time to actually sculpt. I use GoZ to export the model over to Zbrush and then start working in some of the smaller details. In theory, I could do this whole sculpt in Blender, but at this point I feel a bit more comfortable with Zbrush. The brushes feel a bit nicer, and for a higher detail model like this, I do like having the Z remesher. That being said, the previous dragon head I sculpted, I made completely in Blender. If you haven't seen that red dragon, I'll leave a link to that in the description below and in the card in the corner. That one isn't fully voiced over, but it'll still give you a pretty good idea on how sculpting a model like this would look in Blender. That being said, the sculpting process is pretty similar independent of what software you're using, so I'd recommend still sticking around and watching some Zbrush videos in general, even if you only sculpt in Blender. Since I've done most of the blocking in Blender anyway, I'm gonna be focusing on the details here in Zbrush, though I'll still occasionally be making some proportional tweaks here and there using the move brush as I feel they're needed. At this point, I'm mostly using the clay buildup brush as well as the damp standard brush, which in Blender would be the clay strips brush and the draw sharp or crease brush. And I'm using them to build up some of the shapes that I still want and sharpen edges or cut creases where I need them. And then with all the remaining basic shapes built up, it's time to work on the surface details like the scales. At first I considered giving him kind of snake-like overlapping scales, but then I decided that didn't actually fit with the idea for how these dragons work, because it didn't really make sense for little hairs or feathers to be coming out in between those big overlapping scales. So instead I went for some like small randomly placed rounded ones. For that I just sketched them in with the clay buildup brush and then creased around them with the damp standard brush. And then I also went over them with the trim dynamic brush, I think, to just flatten the tops a little bit. There's probably some brush alphas out there that would make it a lot easier to make small scales like this, but since it was such a small area, it didn't take long at all to do them manually, and by doing them manually I was able to control the shape and size better. For example, I have a couple of slightly bigger ones near the big plates on the front of the neck, and then they get smaller towards the back. And speaking of the plates, next I work on refining those a bit. I've built up the basic shape properly, but they were still a bit rough around the edges, so I used the damp standard and the pinch brush to clean up the edges a bit, and then the H polish and trim dynamic brushes to sort of scrape down the surface to make it a bit smoother. It's a bit hard to explain, but if you try it out, you'll understand what I mean. In Blender, you could achieve a similar effect with the scrape brush and the pinch brush. With the neck mostly done, I move on to the face. I don't start on the scales there right away. I do some cleaning up and detailing of the underlying shapes first, making sure the mouth is properly creased and the jaw is as sharp as I want it to be, and the big scales on the eyebrows are properly sharpened. For that, I just turned on AccuCurve in the move brush. In Blender, you could do that with a grab brush by just switching the fall off from smooth to sharp. Once I'm happy with how the bigger shapes are, I once again go back to working on the plates, continuing the ones from the neck all the way down to under the jaw, and then adding in the smaller scales all over the face, as well as another set of plates on the top of the nose. I use all the same methods for this that I used when I was working on the neck. At this point, I've actually only been working in Dynamesh mode, which is the ZBrush equivalent to the voxel remesher in Blender, meaning I haven't actually used any features yet that are completely exclusive to ZBrush. That means all the stuff I've done so far you could easily do in Blender too. I just prefer ZBrush a bit at this point because the brushes feel a bit nicer and I've gotten used to the navigation here. It feels quite a bit more comfortable. Plus it does work a bit more like smoothly as the resolution gets higher, I've noticed, compared to Blender. Plus, while for this sculpt I haven't yet used any of the features that are exclusive to ZBrush, I do like having them available for when I need them. At this point now I've finally merged all the objects together, at least all the ones that are actually gonna be merged. The crystals and the eyeball are gonna stay separate. So now I can sculpt in the final details and actually use a Z-remesher. With symmetry turned on and using the legacy version of the Z-remesher, I end up with a good result first try, so I can just subdivide it, reproject all the details from the Dynamesh version, and then go on and sculpt in the remaining. At this point, I'm mostly just going around with a damn standard, smooth, and pinch brushes to sharpen all the little creases and edges and add in the last few tiny little folds and wrinkles and scratches and stuff like that. While I'm working on smaller details around the center line, I occasionally turn off symmetry just to make sure I have a tiny little bit of asymmetry and it doesn't look too perfect. Usually for a creature or character sculpt like this, I'd want to break the symmetry a lot more, maybe have the head tilted a little bit, or just, especially around the middle, have a lot more asymmetrical scales and wrinkles and all that stuff. But in this case, because of the crystals, having the head tilted or something like that would be quite a pain. And for the scales and such in general, it didn't feel like too obvious that he was almost perfectly symmetrical. I think in part because the big scales that are around the center line are ones you would expect to be quite even because they're just like these large plates. Plus, I didn't want the extra work of having to sculpt a whole bunch of details separately on both sides of the model, because this was supposed to be like a chill, quick project. It didn't turn out quick. It was originally supposed to go out last week, so I can get back on my consistent weekly upload schedule, but that didn't happen. But yeah, there's not that much left to say about the remaining sculpting process. As I said, it's just going in and refining the stuff I already have. So I'll leave you with the music for a bit and get back when there's something new and interesting to talk about. And it's time for new and interesting stuff. I'm happy with how the sculpt is looking at this point, so I switched to a lighter material and then used poly paints to paint in some base colors for the dragon. My plan is to add a more fancy shader to it in Blender, but I need some base colors to work with. I don't actually end up using these poly paints for the final texture. I end up doing the materials a bit differently, but I'm leaving them in anyway. Pearl is a very light colored dragon. At this point I've painted him actually completely white, but later on in the process I'm gonna darken him down a bit to make him slightly more beige and like alive looking, because while he is very light, he isn't actually supposed to be albino. And even if you were having the white color be just so bright white, doesn't feel particularly natural and doesn't really look good in a final render. And speaking of final render, I was pretty satisfied with the colors at that point, even though I ended up kind of disliking them later and changing them. So it's time to move back to Blender and work on the final materials. At this point I had to switch from using Eevee to using cycles for my shaders, because for the main body, I wanted to use the pointiness attribute from the geometry node to add a bit of detail in between the scales, and that node just doesn't work in Eevee for some reason. Aside from the pointiness, I also mixed in some ambient occlusion to the vertex colors, and I used a hue saturation brightness adjustment node to tweak the colors a bit. Next, it's time to work on the crystals again, but not yet their material. I noticed while sculpting that there's kind of this abrupt transition between the dragon's scales and then the relatively large crystals, so I decided to make a whole bunch of smaller ones around the edge to just sort of smooth that whole thing out and make it more of a gradient from very tiny crystals to really big ones in the middle. I deleted all the crystals on the left side so that then when I'm done with the small crystals I can just mirror everything together. And then I started working around the edges, adding in those tiny ones. For that, I went into edit mode on some of the crystals I already have and moved them down on the local z-axis so that the origin is relatively close to the tip of the crystal. Then I could turn on snapping and snap rotation to surface and just duplicate the tiny crystals around, and they'd automatically snap to the surface with the correct orientation. Once I was happy with how they looked, I mirrored them over the same way I did the big ones earlier. I parented them to an empty and then scaled that empty to -1 on the x-axis. And back to the body shader for a hot second. Here you can see me adding in that cavity map I mentioned I wanted to add. As you can see, it really highlights the ridges and darkens all these fine creases in between the scales and such, so it was a good way to add a lot of extra detail to the material of the main body. I also messed around with a whole bunch of different inputs to try and get like more of a variety of texture to the surface of the dragon, but given that I had only painted some base color info, I wasn't really able to get that with the current shader. I'll end up revisiting and fixing some of that later, but for now it's time to finally work on those crystals. I spent ages working on the shader for the crystals, trying a whole bunch of different stuff out, failing most of the time, and I figured you guys wouldn't get that much from just a time-lapse of me fumbling around with nodes in this tiny window. So instead, here's the finished shader. I'll put a link to a high-resolution image of the node setup in the description below, and maybe like a link to a Blender file with the shader. But for now, let me open up Blender and explain to you roughly how this whole thing works. So here we are in Blender with the finished shader. It looks pretty complicated, but the core isn't actually that complicated. That being said, I'm not going to explain everything, like every single node. If you want to take a look at how all the individual values and stuff are set up, I'm gonna leave a link to a higher resolution image of the shader in the description below, and I'll try and see if I can add like a file to download the shader itself, but no promises on that one. So the core of the shader is this mix shader. It mixes my glossy BSDF with this mix shader, which is refraction and translucent. I'll get to those in a little bit. The important thing is that for the factor for the mix shader, I'm using Fresnel, which is essentially this black and white kind of map mask thingy where the edges are very light and the things facing towards the viewer are relatively dark. So for this mix shader, what it means is that around the edges there's a lot of glossiness, and towards the things that are facing the viewers, there's less, which is how things also work in the real world. I don't know why it works that way, it just does, and it gives you a more realistic looking shader. And then for the glossiness itself, the important thing here is that I'm not just using white, then I might as well use the principled shader because that's just your regular glossiness. Instead, I'm using a whole bunch of bright colors, and again, I'm using the layer weight node, in this case the facing output, which looks pretty similar, and I'm using that plugged into this color ramp. This mix factor isn't that important because it's not mixing that much in. I'm plugging it into this color ramp, and it's giving me this rainbow colored sort of these colors on the sides of the crystal. As you can see, as I turn it, based on the angle each plane has towards the viewer, it sort of changes color and gives you this iridescent effect. And since I'm mixing that into the color of the roughness here, it means that in general the crystals are gonna have this iridescence. I have a couple other values mixed in here. I have back here this object info random node that I'm using to mix in here into this color mix node, and here into this hue saturation node, just to give the crystals a bit more randomness so that each individual one doesn't have the exact same iridescence colors, let's say. But those aren't as important. What's important is this facing node going into the color ramp, which is set to hue, saturation, lightness, and near. And yeah, that gives me this really cool shiny iridescent effect. Then next to the other side of that mix shader, we have this refraction and translucent. I'm using the refraction because they're crystals, I want them to be refractive. But again, I didn't want to just use a glass shader because I don't want the reflections from that glass shader, I want the reflections from my iridescent glossy node. So here I'm just getting the refractions. You can't really see them that well, sadly, but they do what I want them to do. They barely have any color. If you look at them, they're pretty much white. I might as well just make them straight up white. Yeah, they're actually completely white. This mix node here is set to a factor of 1, so it's not actually doing anything. Might as well just leave it white. And this whole thing is mixed in, as I said, with this translucent BSDF, which is just translucent, relatively self-explanatory. That one is actually using the colors. I'm again using this object info random, which assigns a random value to each object, mixing that into the color ramp to reduce the range, and then plugging that into this hue saturation node. The base color is this blue, and I'm plugging in the randomness into the hue so that they get a bit of randomness, as I said. And then I'm mixing in a little bit of white to get the translucency to the color I want, because in general something like a translucent shader darkens the values, so I wanted them to be a bit lighter to just make sense for the shader. A lot of the stuff around here is like set up the way it is because I was making some minor adjustments here and there. So this node essentially represents the colors that I actually want as the base color, and I'm using this here to mix in some other things so I can just adjust it to see how it visually looks correct. So yeah, I have this translucent BSTF and refraction, and then I'm mixing them using this gradient texture, using a color ramp to adjust it to the way I want it to be. So the tips here are going to be very refractive, and the rest is just translucent, which gives me this kind of effect. you can't really see it that well, and it looks weirdly bright and not super refractive. But once I mix in the glossy again, it's suddenly less bright, it's more just glossy, like shiny. Yeah, and that creates the crystals the way I want them to be. And that's essentially most of the shader done already. The rest over here, this whole corner, is just normals. So like a little bit of bump here and there and a bit of roughness to make everything look good. So here you can see the final normal output that I'm putting into everything that has a normal input, like all the shaders and the layer weight here. But the inputs here is just like a noise texture that's stretched out. I have like a wave texture that's super distorted for some little scuffs and scratches. There's an ambient occlusion here, which I mixed with another noise texture to sort of make these slightly scuffed edges. And I'm just mixing all of that into these bump maps, sequence of bump maps. So here you can see this slight bit of bump in the surface of the crystals, just enough to sort of prevent the reflections from being these completely perfect reflections and just make them a tiny bit more natural looking, like scuffed, as I said. And this output goes into all the normal inputs I have everywhere and just gives them that little bit of randomness. There's also, from this wave texture, the output I also plugged in, like I also adjusted with a color ramp and plugged into the roughness of the glossy shader, which is really the only important bit of roughness for this shader. And that just makes some of the little scuffed edges slightly rougher, so slightly less reflective. And yeah, that's pretty much it for the shader. As I said, you can take a look at a higher resolution screenshot of it in the description below to look at all the values, especially like in these mapping nodes. They might be relevant, and maybe in some of the color ramps and stuff like that. But for now, that's about it for this shader. And back to the time-lapse. Now that the crystals have this really fancy material, I can't really get away with the dragon having this relatively uniform texture and stuff like that. So I grabbed the lowest resolution of the ZRemeshed model and brought that into Blender to UV unwrap and get some actual texture maps going. I tried using Smart UV Project to unwrap this one, but I ended up with a whole bunch of tiny islands that were kind of weird looking and just a model full of unnecessary seams. So instead I unwrapped it manually, and that was pretty quick and easy. I just needed like 3 or 4 seams in a handful of places and got a pretty decent UV map. Once I had that done, I grabbed the new unwrapped model, imported it back into ZBrush, subdivided it, and reprojected all my details again. Fortunately, I didn't really lose any details in that process. Then I went back to sculpting for a little bit, really just adding a bit of surface detail to things like the horns, which I felt were missing that bit of roughness in their material. Then once I was done with that, I opened up the multi-map exporter plugin and baked myself some ambient occlusion and cavity maps that I could use for the material. And of course I had to bake a displacement map to get back all of the sculpted detail that I was missing in the lower poly version. This has a little added bonus that I can now turn down the resolution and detail of the model to have things render faster. Anyway, back in ZBrush, instead of painting the base color, I decided to paint a black and white mask that I can use to mask off different sections of the model that are supposed to have kind of different surface textures. In this case, I gave the horns and chin horns black, the main scales the medium gray, and the big plate scales on the neck white. That way, back in Blender, when I'm working on the materials, I can easily use this black and white mask to control how I want different things to affect the texture. So I could give them different roughness, different amounts of bump, and different amounts of like ambient occlusion and cavity depending on what I need. And here's how that shader ended up. A big tangle of like color ramp nodes and mix RGB nodes, and a bit of ambient occlusion and cavity thrown in there. It's a huge mess, but I was able to easily bake it down into a set of manageable textures. A base color, subsurface scattering, roughness, and bump. Next, I work on the eyeball. That was originally just a sphere with the pupil and iris details painted on, but now that the rest of the model is shaded with so much detail, I had to sort of sculpt in a bit more detail to the eye. So I used a UV unwrapped sphere, which I sculpted using multi-resolution in Blender, and then I used just like an additional sphere with a glass shader on top of that for the glossiness. For the iris, I just sculpted in some rough detail using clay strips and crease in Blender. It doesn't have to look super realistic or even necessarily make sense. I just wanted it to have some surface texture so that it wouldn't look out of place with the rest of the model. Then I added an image texture to it and manually painted in the eye color. It's once again not like a super detailed iris painting. I'm gonna use some ambient occlusion later to add a bit more detail, and it's just a relatively small part of the model, so you don't actually see that it's not as detailed as it probably could be. And to be honest, at this point I had already spent way more time on the model than I was planning, so I really wanted to be done and not spend extra time on details that wouldn't be super visible. So, aside from mixing in the ambient occlusion, I just used a couple of color adjustment nodes to make sure the eye color matched the rest of the model, and then I moved on to the next part of the process. And the next part of the process is more shaders. I felt like the transition between the scales and the crystals could still be smoothed out a little bit more, so I went into the shader for the head and added in this little bit of extra stuff. It's essentially a mix between a glossy and diffuse shader that has around about the same colors as the crystals and the same kind of iridescence. I also used a Voronoi texture for the normals to give it some kind of crystal-like sparkliness. Then I used a mix shader to mix that in with a material I already had for the head, and as a factor, I created a new black and white image texture that I could then paint on. To save myself a little bit of time, I baked some ambient occlusion onto that mask texture, that way everything that was intersecting with the crystals was already painted black, and I just had to paint the tiny little details sort of branching out from where the crystals are. These little hand-painted crystals aren't perfect, they're a little bit too round and like fuzzy, but they do the trick of tying the model together and adding the final little finishing touch. And here's the finished model in all its sparkly glory. This whole turntable took 10 hours or so to render, despite the fact that I actually have a really good PC. But it was worth it. I will admit the crystals don't look exactly like I had imagined them or kind of hoped they would look. I was originally gonna try and mess around with some like really fancy shader that has like internal cracks and volumetrics to control the opacity of the crystals and stuff like that. But turns out I'm not a shader expert, so that didn't work out. That being said, I'm really happy with how they look anyway. They're really sparkly and iridescent, and in big groups like this, I don't think the extra details would have actually added that much. I'm also quite happy with the new design. I think the big horns suit him quite well. Originally, I had given him small horns because I wanted like his main feature to be the crystals, but I think the two can coexist without like really fighting for attention, if you know what I mean. And I'm also really happy with the improvement in this model compared to the one from 2019. A lot of the differences, of course, come down to the fact that the old one was made for Eevee, while the new one is made for Cycles, and the design is a bit different, but I can still see a whole lot of stuff that I've improved at over the last 3 years, which is always very nice. Anyway, that's been all for me for today. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. If you did, feel free to leave a like and subscribe and all that, and maybe take a look at some of my other links down in the description below. With all that being said, I hope you guys have a nice week, and see you all next time.